Good morning. Today is August 30. Um, let's get started. So, Arthur Burns, who was the chairman of the Fed during the 1970s, said in a rapidly changing world, the opportunities for making mistakes are legion, which is certainly true. One way to think about this whole episode is that after World War II and the end of depression, and with the prosperity they saw, economists and policymakers became a little bit too confident about their ability to keep the economy on an even keel. They use the term fine tuning to refer to the notion that the Fed and fiscal policy and other government policies could keep the economy more or less perfectly on course and not worry about bumps and wiggles in the economy. That turned out to be too optimistic, too hubristic, and as we collectively learned during the 1970s when the efforts of policymakers resulted not in a lower unemployment rate, which was the original goal, but instead in a very sharp increase in inflation. So, one of the themes here is that, and this probably applies in any complex endeavor, a little humility never hurts. There was a reaction to the increase in inflation in the 1970s, and the key person in this period is Chairman Paul Volcker, who remains to this day an influential figure in economic policy discussions. President Jimmy Carter, whose re-election was seriously threatened by the poor performance of the US economy, appointed Volcker to be the new chairman of the Fed. He did so partly because he thought that Volcker was a tough central banker who would do what was necessary to get inflation under control. And Volcker, who stands 6 feet 8 and smokes a big cigar, certainly gave the impression of somebody who was willing to take strong action. Volcker had been in office for only a few months when he determined the strong action was needed to address the inflation problem. In October 1979, he and the Federal Open Market Committee, the policymaking committee of the Fed, instituted a strong break in the way monetary policy was managed. Basically, it allowed the Fed to raise interest rates quite sharply. Raising interest rates slows the economy and brings inflation pressures down. As Volcker said, to break the inflation cycle, we must have credible and disciplined monetary policy. And it worked. In the years after this program began, inflation fell quite sharply. In figure 8, you can see that from 1980 to 1983, inflation fell from about 12 or 13% all the way down to about 3%, a relatively quick decline in inflation that offset the problems of the late 1970s. In that respect, the policies of the 1980s were quite successful. They achieved their objectives of bringing inflation under control. Nothing is free, however, and one of the effects of these policies was to raise interest rates quite sharply for consumers and businesses. I had just gotten out of graduate school, and I remember in about 1981 or 1982 looking at the possibility of buying a home and being informed that the rate for a 3-year mortgage was 18.5%. So interest rates were quite high, and as one might expect, that brought down economic activity and effective inflation as well. In figure 9, you see the unemployment rate during this period. The high interest rate, which were necessary to bring down inflation, also caused a very sharp recession. The unemployment rate in 1982 was almost 11%, even higher than we saw in the most recent recession. So there were definitely very negative side effects from workers' actions. As you can imagine, the political pressure on the Fed and on Chairman Volcker was intense. During this period, it was common practice to mail to the Fed bits of 2 by 4s. And on the 2 by 4s, it would say, "Stop killing construction," or "Save the farmer," or whatever, because the high interest rates were having very negative effects on the economy. I keep a few of these on my desk to remind me that inflation is a concern and that we always have to pay attention to price stability. But this is also an example of why independence is important. If Volcker had needed to be re-elected, perhaps he would not have been able to sustain his policy. Instead, he maintained an independent monetary policy. He received at least sufficient support from President Ronald Reagan and from the Congress to be able to carry through the policy, which succeeded in bringing inflation down. During the 1970s, output and inflation were very volatile. We saw how much inflation moved around. There was a pretty sharp recession in 1973 to 1975 after the OPEC embargo. And then there was more volatility in the early 1980s as Volcker brought down inflation and the economy went into recession. Volcker left the chairmanship in 1987, and he was succeeded by Alan Greenspan, who held that position for almost 19 years, from 1987 to 2006. One of Greenspan's important accomplishments for most of his tenure was achieving greater economic stability. As he said, an environment of greater economic stability has been key to the impressive growth in the standards of living in the United States. There was so much improvement in the stability of the economy that the period has come to be known as the Great Moderation, as opposed to the Great Stagflation of the 1970s or the Great Depression of the 1930s. The Great Moderation was a very rare and striking phenomenon. Figure 10 shows the variability of real GDP growth from 1950 essentially to the present. The line shows quarterly growth rates in GDP. So a sharp peak shows an increase in GDP growth, and a drop shows a decline in GDP growth. These are quarterly quarterly numbers. You can see the bounciness, periods of rapid growth followed by periods of slower growth. The shaded area in the left-hand portion of the graph is a one standard deviation band. Essentially, it is a measure of the average volatility of GDP growth quarter to quarter during the period between 1950 and 1985. You can see that GDP growth was pretty variable throughout the entire period. There was a lot of volatility in the economy. There were a number of recessions, including the severe ones in 1963 and 1981. Now look at what happens to GDP variability between 1986 and 2007 or so. The variability from quarter to quarter is much less, and the shaded band to the right shows the average variability of one standard variation for GDP growth in this latter latter period, rather latter period. It is later, late this later period, this latter period. It is very striking how much more stable the economy was over this roughly 20-year period. This was true not only for real GDP growth, it was also true for inflation. Figure 11 shows basically the same picture. The vertical line in the middle of the graph splits the time period into pre 1986 and post 1986. The graph shows inflation quarter by quarter as measured by the CPI. Again, the shaded bar on the left side of the graph shows one standard deviation, average volatility of inflation in the pre 1986 period. You can see the huge spikes in inflation in the 1970s, and then in post 1986, you see much lower volatility. So both growth and inflation were more stable to a quite remarkable extent, which economists commented on quite frequently. That was the so called Great Moderation. Ah, So we talked about Great Moderation today. Thank you for watching.